And I guess you saw us do the shot, so we're not going to do that again for the sake of just hearing the bracha again. But all right, here we go, just so everyone
But
can...
half a serving.
All right, so the point behind the tequila that I'd said earlier, yes, all right, we've got our person who's watching this at 2 a.m. or something like that, who apparently is drinking with us as well. So you got to do another l'chaim with us.
It's already 4. It's like,
4 in the
early morning. I also woke up the entire week at 4:30, so it's not that bad.
All right, second bracha. Baruch atah Adonai el-melech haolam shechol niyeh bevro l'chaim l'chaim. So the point with tequila is that we've got the most controversial potential podcast yet, already 4 into it. And if for some reason I say something or you say something completely daft, that we actually have an excuse, right? Because BeitVirtuali is all about not taking responsibility for our words and actions.
Exactly.
That's hashtag sarcasm, everyone. Okay, very good. So here we are, episode number 4. And Katrin, go ahead and reformulate the first question.
Yeah. All right. So last things first. Your last video was about the names of God. And we were talking about the usage of the word HaShem, for instance, instead of other things. And a colleague of you asked the question if you actually also use the word HaShem on a, let's say, daily basis or in a normal conversation, or just, I don't know, when you pray. And then also there's always this discussion that I think was also mentioned there, that what do you do if you write God, like, what is it, G-O-D? In English, do you put a hyphen in between?
Yeah. So the question came from a dear friend and colleague, I think one of the great rabbis going today. So if you want to see an amazing rabbi, Rabbi Adrian Schell in Wimbledon in England, German rabbi, one of the several who is working in the United Kingdom right now, an amazing human being. So he had said that he got the point of what I was trying to say about brachot, and using Hashem when I'm teaching instead of doing. But what do I do in normal life? And it's a worthy question because this is one of those things, and I got a lot of feedback on this, but most of the feedback was private emails, people who have said Hashem because that's their comfort place, and they've said it in a Reformed synagogue, and they've had people get very, very upset with them, and I've had people get very, very upset with me.
Right.
And it is a trigger word, for want of a better, because it is something that is normally used more in an Orthodox milieu than a Reform milieu. And when you say something in a Reform milieu that's generally associated with Orthodoxy, then there can be issues with that. And that's really what my video last week was about, the second part of it. So if you haven't watched it, we'll put that link right down below. But the answer to that, there's 2 levels to the answer. And the really deep level is going to be my video coming out this week, which is part 2 of the name game. But the answer is, what I use in everyday speech when I'm talking is I say the eternal. And you can attest to that is how I refer to that which is greater than us. And I'll explain more about that in the video coming up this week, but it's because I don't want to use any label that is going to point us away from something eternal. And so the idea of using the eternal, that's from Moses Mendelssohn, Der Ewige. And what's interesting is that was run with fully in the French language. And it doesn't matter if you are Jewish or Christian in France. Essentially, every modern translation of Le Bible in French says l'Éternel, which is it's magnificent. Yeah. And the reason I love it is because, and this is the point of next week's video, so I won't get too much into it, the name of God is not a name. John is a name, but we have to apply a label. We have to have a pointer, but the pointer is to something that is not a human. But we refer to names as person, places, or things, and the eternal in Jewish tradition is not a person, place, or a thing, unless you go into the Kabbalistic area and that God is the place of the universe. Read Lawrence Kushner's God Was in This Place, who formulates that really well. And so, will I say Hashem in everyday language? The answer is, it completely depends. When I was in Mannheim, which is an Orthodox community over the High Holy Days, and I gave a shiur, I said Hashem several times because it is a non-problematic term. But we also have this ethical concept of not putting a stumbling block before the blind. So if I were to, in a location where I know it's going to get negative press, if I say HaShem in a Reform synagogue, it's because I actually want to make a point, or because I want to teach a bracha, or because I'm trying to push boundaries, but I'll almost always explain why I'm doing it. Then it goes to, I think it's a slightly different discussion on, do you hyphenate God? It's not a different discussion because it's the same issue on, it's more associated with Orthodoxy, sometimes conservatism, or Masorti, that people will write in English G-D instead of G-O-D. So it's still related in that it's seen as more Orthodox. There's actually an essay that I read years and years ago, talked about my God isn't hyphenated. And it was a polemic against the use of the hyphen in Orthodoxy. And there were some beautiful points.
Was this a Reform person?
Yeah, it was a Reform. I don't remember who it was. If I can find it, I'll try to link the essay below because it's worth reading. And the point of the hyphen is something we call boneh seag ala Torah, so build a fence around the Torah. And this is an entire idea. The way it was explained to me originally, and I love this, is if a child goes into a kitchen and reaches up to the handle hanging over the stove and starts pulling it down and there's boiling water in it, oftentimes what a parent will do is something, don't touch that. As a matter of fact, don't ever even come into the kitchen. That's called building a fence around the Torah. And the most common way we see that in Judaism is the 18 minutes before sundown. So are you absolutely engaging in an offense against God? Well, no, because that's not what sin is to begin with. But are you missing the mark if you light Shabbos candles 3 minutes before sundown? And the answer is no. You have to light candles before sundown. So the 18 minutes is a typological number of saying, if you do it at this point, you're guaranteed to not step on a boundary. So we have a lot of places in Judaism where in order to make sure we do not transgress a law, that we do not then engage in the right at the last moment, that we build enough of a fence around it to where, we don't transgress. And within Reform Judaism, we see this idea of transgressing a sin to be a much less metaphysical sort of thing. I'm not going to have Zeus throw a lightning bolt down and zap me if I light the Shabbos candles 2 minutes afterwards, but yet we still try to do it on time. Why is that? Because we're engaged in dialogue with tradition. And so the question is, why do you put a hyphen? Well, it's part of building a fence around Torah. What we're forbidden to do is to destroy the name of God after we've written it. We can't write Yud He Vav He, so the written Hebrew name of God, and then scratch it out, erase it, rip that, which is why we bury documents in a geniza that have the name of God on it. And when you go and see famous genizas like in Cairo, there's a lot of documents that had nothing to do with God. Ketubot, it's a little bit to do with God on that one, but you had documents of trade between people that were there because the people who put them in the geniza didn't know if the name of God was there or not. They just knew that it was Hebrew. So rather than to potentially transgress, they would then geniza the Hebrew document. And so the idea is this a real metaphysical thing, destroying the name of God or not? And there's a lot of wonderful debate on what do we do when we type it? Is that actually written, or is a bit and a byte actually real? And that's its own discussion. And so the answer to the question is, I think you have to be conscious that this is about two things. One, it's a type of, and I don't mean this in a bad sense right now, it's a type of virtue signaling. If you're writing for an Orthodox congregation, then you are saying that you understand the minhag hamakom by writing G-D. If you're writing for a Reform congregation, most likely you're saying you understand minhag hamakom by writing G-O-D. Either way, you should know what the underlying logic is. And that is, I'm building a fence around the Torah. If I write G-O-D, that's at least a pointer to something that we need to be conscious of, this idea of not taking the name of the eternal in vain. But what does that mean? And that's really the subject of my video this week. So I hope that's a little bit of an answer. The final answer of what do I do is I used to write G-D in everything that I did. Now that I'm working on multiple books that use the name of God in multiple ways all the time, I do not. And because I think it's become a barrier to understanding for a larger audience. But that being said, there would be times that I'm writing an article for Monheim in the next week or so, and I'll write G-TT got anytime that I write. But what I'll really try to do instead is write Der Ewige.
Right. So I also like Der Ewige a lot, or the eternal, and you can also always, or most of the time, replace it.
Yes.
But I think that where the question is coming from is this kind of, especially if I think if you're non-Orthodox, it's like, is this, when does superstition start and when does it end? And we started with not writing Yud Hey Vav Hey, but saying like Yud Yud in Hebrew,
right,
or Yud Hey, or Yud, these thingies, how
right.
are they called in English?
Quotes, but it functions differently.
And hey, and so on. And then we did it in the transliteration, that we said that we don't write Yud Hey Vav Hey, but we write Adonai. And then people said like, yeah, but Adonai you cannot use, you have to use HaShem. And now people even say you cannot say HaShem,
right,
but use something else. And then you spin it further, and then also in translations, you put a hyphen then in between the words, or something else to leave a space that you don't write the word. And then at some point it just feels like superstition, that you are afraid to write God, because you're not, in the end of the day, you're not allowed to say the word Yud Hey Vav Hey,
or even know how to say it according to
exactly.
Jewish tradition.
And I think this is where it's basically coming from.
I think it's an amazing point. The ontos of Reform Judaism is oftentimes misunderstood, because the great grandfather of Reform Judaism would be Moses Mendelssohn, and a lot of people think that Reform Judaism is purely and completely a rationalist sort of movement, or accompanying the Haskalah. And that's not really, really true. It's Reform Judaism, the Moses Mendelssohn level of it. He basically said that we ought to follow tradition, but not superstition. And this is a big, long debate around burying the dead the day of their burial or not. And one of the first reform moments was Moses Mendelssohn wrote essentially a response saying, listen, the reason that we bury the dead immediately is the superstition that demons are beating the body until it goes into the earth. And if there's any, this was back when we were worried that we were burying people who were still alive, and the test for if someone was actually dead at the time was holding a feather in front of their nose 4 hours after they died, which someone can be almost dead and still not move a feather there. And so Moses Mendelssohn pointed out that the reason that the tradition exists, because the halakha, or the actual origin of all this, is you can't leave a dead body in the house where it dies overnight. That's the statement from the Talmud. And so the point is, we should know where this stuff comes from. What it boils down to is it becomes superstition when we, oh my goodness, HaShem is now an elevated word, exactly what you said. That's missing the point entirely. I think that if we write G-D, there are two aspects. One, we need to communicate why we're doing it, if that's something that can possibly cause confusion. And number two, we should be fully aware of why we're doing it. If we're doing it because we're afraid that we're going to get zapped from Zeus in heaven, then we're making a big mistake, because that ain't Judaism, for one thing. But the other side of it is, there is a reason for it. And the reason is reasonable if one follows that argumentation. But if we're doing it without understanding the reason, then what are we doing? And does Judaism want us? Does Judaism call us? Is Judaism a dialogue about blind faith? And I would, usually what people point to then is the Akedat Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac, as well. Yes, there's this point for blind faith. I'll make the argument that that story has nothing to do with the concept of blind faith, because we're Bnei Yisrael. We are the children of the one who argues with God, who wrestles with God. So, if we write G-OD, I think the answer, if we say HaShem, I think the answer to all this is, first of all, I don't care if you're Orthodox, conservative, Reform, secular, humanist, Haredi, I don't care what it is. If you're not aware of why you're doing it, then it's your job to learn more about it. How do you learn more about it? Watch podcasts like this one. Read about it. Go into the history of it. And so what is acceptable or what is not? Well, first of all, if you have written name of God in Hebrew, Yud He Vav He, and you're scratching that out, you're being incredibly disrespectful. And you're not going to be put to death today or anything like that. But what is it about you that feels the need to do that? Because that seems like a blind hatred at that point. If I do it out of ignorance, then that's a different level to explore. And if I do it out of superstition, that's a different level. So what it boils down to is awareness and respect.
Yeah. But this is like the other point that you also mentioned with the Geniza. As far as I heard it or learned it or whatever, when you have when you, for instance, on Sefaria print out you save a file with the word of God on your computer, you're allowed to delete this file.
Yeah.
But when you print it out, then you have to put it into a Geniza. And I find this also really confusing.
Right.
Because, where's the difference, And I think this is also something that maybe someone has to write a tshuva about it.
I'll see if I can find a good one to put in there. So tshuva, an answer to a question. First source I tend to go to would actually be the conservative center for that. So go to rabbinical.assembly.org. The reason I say conservative and not reform is conservative considers itself connected with halakha, whereas reform considers itself a non-halakhic movement. Generally, that's not always the case. That's just a general statement. Considers halakha to be binding when it's ethical and non-binding when it's ritual. And I tend to be academically farther left than most reform rabbis. On reform, I tend to be significantly to the right when it comes to ritual. So in some ways, I'm very conservative. In some ways, I'm more reform than reform. And that's very confusing to some people. But a good place to always start is the CGLS, the Conservative Jewish Legal CGLS, but rabbinical.assembly.org, because they will go, they will go through and their response, so which you can download masses of them in PDF file, always go back to the historicity and then the chain of evolution, kind of the chain of custody of the document, the chain of evolution from the first mention of a something to various binding hilchot or decisions that are made today. So that's a good place. That being said, a lot of the body, the corpus of reform responsa, so one of my teachers, Walter Jacob, is responsible for the vast majority of that in the 20th century. And if you want to learn from one of the Gedolim of the last 100 years, it's Walter Jacob. And it's absolutely worth getting a hold of his volumes and reading through that. He's responsible for massive amounts, but it's not considered binding in a reform the same way that it would be with conservative, although in conservative, it's not binding necessarily either. And that's a different discussion entirely on what is binding and why and how.
Interesting.
Not where I thought we'd go with that, but that's why we do a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I also already feel the tequila.
All right.
This is,
okay. Then we're going from easier questions to answer to harder. So this is going to be an interesting one, folks.
Yeah. So then let's start with the next question. One of our Patreons asked about the Sabbateans and asked the question if they are still considered Jews, which is a generally speaking a really interesting question. Who is a Jew and are the Sabbateans Jews?
Yeah, that's so. The answer is yain, yes and no together, and it depends. So first of all, what are the Sabbateans? These are the followers of Shabbatai Tzvi. So Shabbatai Tzvi, a false messiah or a self-proclaimed messiah in the 17th century, the mid-17th century. He didn't proclaim himself. It was a person named Natan Gaza, so Nathan of Gaza, who did it. Anyway, in the year he was proclaimed, I'm going to try to pull this out of my ears here. It's 1666, something like that. Don't quote me. It's somewhere around there. Yeah. Anyway, so Nathan of Gaza proclaimed Shabbatai Tzvi to be the Mashiach, and massive amounts of Jews followed him. And when he was going through Constantinople, that same year, he was captured by representatives of the Sultan, and they forced him to convert to Islam. So that's within the year of his proclamation, and that just created, well, it's a great psychological exploration, because one of the first things that we got was standard pure cognitive dissonance. Real cognitive dissonance, not the false way they choose, but psychological cognitive dissonance, which says that when you have a belief that is challenged, then you will double down. And a lot of people doubled down that him converting to Islam was the secret way that he would really show that he was the Messiah. Yeah. His family converted, a lot of his closest friends converted. And then there were it was a balagan, to put it short. I'm not a Sabbatian scholar on this one, but that's just a little bit of the background. So part of the question is the practical question, that is, are there Sabbatians that are still alive today? And the answer is no, unless they're completely crypto. The last Sabbatians that were very clearly Sabbatians were, again, I should really have notes in front of you, the Domne people, and they were a group of Turkish Jews who settled, I guess it was around Thessalonica, and they kind of existed through the 20th century. And they converted to Islam essentially at the same time, but they continued with Brit Milah, and they acted as crypto Jews for centuries, literally centuries. And then the first question is, would they be accepted? Well, there aren't really any today. So that will then go to the second part of the question.
But was there kind of a mass conversion then to Islam?
A lot of people at that time converted, yeah, and then other people didn't. And then the question was, do we still follow him as a Messiah or not? And this is right then at the time that Hasidic Judaism comes about. And a lot of the reason that the Misnagdim existed, the people who were against Hasidic Judaism, is they were actually very much afraid that the followers of Hasidut would then also be prone to following this messianic thing. And there were massive amounts of deaths and persecutions because of this. The other great false messiah movement, the Frankists, same sort of thing. And, usually when there's that kind of a balagan, and by the way, Christians and Muslims use this against Jews. They basically said, look, here's the Jewish Messiah, and he can't even stay Jewish. So, I mean, it was a humiliation to Jews, and it was a dark point in history because of the amount of death surrounding it, but also the amount of despair, yush, that existed among the Jewish people. So that doesn't answer the question. The question is a Sabbatian a Jew? And the answer is yain, and it depends. So as usual, yes, no, and it depends. And it depends on who you're talking to, because first of all, what's the definition of a Jew? Number one, born of a Jewish mother. Number two, converting according to Jewish law. Number three, in certain reform or progressive movements around the world, if you're born of a Jewish father. And that's something that, before I even go any further, if you're not coming from Reform Judaism and you think that is somehow an easy path, that's one of the most misunderstood things. You actually really need to read the agreements around that, because in some ways, strangely enough, Reform, especially American Reform, is more strict around this than Orthodoxy. Yeah. And here's the example, because if you're born of a Jewish mother, and were brought up Catholic, and you can show that your mother was Jewish via her ketubah or that sort of thing, and you go to an Orthodox synagogue, you are considered Jewish. You can be called to Torah in that moment, even though if you've never had been in a synagogue in your life. Whereas in Reform Judaism, if you're born of a Jewish mother but were raised Catholic, you are asked to go through a conversion process in order to become a member of that synagogue and be called to Torah. And it's the same thing. The idea of patrilineal descent, and we can argue all day long on if that's a good or a bad idea, and where matrilineal versus patrilineal descent came to begin with, and the dark history of all that. And that's, if you want to ask the question, ask it. We'll talk about it next week, because we love discussing non-controversial things, apparently. But someone who has a Jewish father in American Reform Judaism, now it's also to some extent in the UK, some extent in Canada, functions a little bit differently. But the idea is yes, you'll be accepted for membership in the synagogue as a full Jew if you've had Brit Milah or baby naming, if you've had bar bat mitzvah, if you've had conversion. In other words, if you've had public declarations of your Jewishness your entire life. And so that's, when people just say that that's a haphazard change of halakha, it was actually a well thought out, well considered change of halakha. And even in Germany, where it's really hard to convert, even in non-Orthodox Judaism, someone who comes from patrilineal descent, we tend to consider the conversion process a status confirmation rather than a full conversion. And the people I've worked with that were patrilineal that grew up Jewish, I would work with them for a few months and send them to Beit Din. Whereas people who are converting without a Jewish background, as some of you out there know, it's not easy to do with me whatsoever. So, there's a lot of, with patrilineal descent, a slightly easier path, although that's absolutely not the case. And in some countries, I know Great Britain being one of them, it's really hard to convert via Orthodoxy if you're patrilineal. And so oftentimes some people who are very Orthodox in how they approach Judaism, and that's meant neither positive or negative, it's just a thing, will then be forced to go to Reform in order to go through a conversion. And that seems like we've gotten off the wrong path in Orthodoxy, if that's the case there.
Yeah,
that's,
I agree.
So that's also a different discussion there. And I know that we're going to do a podcast on conversion at some point, because that's its own discussion. So I won't get into much deeper on that one. But anyway, that's your definition of a Jew. And so if you have a Sabbatian come in, then it's going to depend. So a Sabbatian who is going to say the Articles of Faith of Islam, because they've converted to Islam, is a Muslim. Baruch Hashem, that's their choice, but they're not a Jew. Okay, and that's how I'm going to look at it. If within Orthodoxy, it's dealt with very differently, because if someone is halakhically Jewish and then grows up Christian, then that's going to be dealt with in a different series of rules. And that's if you come back into the fold of Judaism and denounce your previous beliefs, then without any change, you're accepted back in. Whereas Reform is going to deal with that as you're a Christian. Unless you convert to Judaism, then you're a Christian. Not that there's anything wrong with being a Christian, but being a Christian is not being a Jew, which is why it's so problematic. Jews for Jesus, for example, so you have someone who's halakhically a Jew who becomes an evangelical Christian. Well, they're a Christian, but within Orthodoxy, they are a heretical Jew. So it's a really complicated thing, and the Sabbateans are going to fall into that. Now, the one thing that is the historical real cutoff is during the 18th century, there were massive acts of herem against the Sabbateans. And this is starting from an important rabbi named Emden, I think is of Prague. So part of the disputation with Moses Mendelssohn I talked about earlier, dealing with early burial of Jews. Really famous, capital C, conservative, really, really traditional, far-right Jew of the time. And he kind of made it his life's purpose to go after leaders or perceived leaders of the Sabbateans, and that ended multiple major Beit Din, pronounced herem on all, so excommunication essentially, on all followers of Shabbatai Tzvi. So within Orthodoxy, especially Ashkenaz Orthodoxy, the answer to that question is going to be none of them will be considered a Jew today because of 200-year-old herem, and they would have to go through a full conversion, even if they essentially could prove halakhic Judaism through another sense. So it's really complicated. What it boils down to is Sabbateans became, much like Christianity or Islam, their own religion, is I guess the way to look at it. And unless someone was crypto, but at the same point, someone who practices Jewish practice will still most likely, in all streams of Judaism, have to go through conversion. And I knew one person who grew up in a crypto family who converted to Judaism in the Seattle area. Fascinating story. But basically, someone who grew up coming through Sabbateans who wanted full membership in the larger and smaller Jewish community would have to go through a conversion process. And how that works and the nuances of that is for a different podcast.
Okay. So I don't ask a follow-up question?
If it's about conversion, then let's hold that for an upcoming podcast. Yeah, because we just want to be as uncontroversial as possible.
Yeah. But I just had this thought when you talked about in an Orthodox setting, if I have a Jewish mother but grew up as a Catholic, are they then? I was just thinking about Baalei Tshuva.
Yeah.
Are they considered then Baalei Tshuva, whatever the
essentially. Yeah, I don't know if
translation is, or
so you
does the Orthodox movement then has a program, or how do you actually, you cannot just step into a synagogue and say like, yeah, hey, I'm here now and I'm considered you are considered a born Jew, but you know nothing about it, and I find it really complicated. So are there programs for people who return to Judaism?
Yeah. So
setting?
I'm going to put on my Orthodox hat for a second here.
Okay.
And I'm going to approach this. So part of the issue is if you're coming at this podcast and you feel yourself to be a Reformed Jew or a conservative Jew and an Orthodox Jew, you've already got a filter by which you're stepping into on hearing every word that I say. And if one's coming from a Reform direction, one is going to look at Orthodoxy as monolithic. And obviously it's not monolithic. So part of the answer is it's going to depend on the rabbi. It's going to depend on the shul, the experience of the rabbi, the sophistication of the rabbi, just like every conservative and Reformed shul. Just like there's some rabbis out there who are brilliant service leaders and you wouldn't want them near a pastoral counseling session to save your life. And there's some you wouldn't want in the pulpit to save your life and you want at your bedside when you're sick. It's the same sort of thing. Certain people have different specialties. And so from an Orthodox, putting my Orthodox hat on, if I were back in an Einheitsgemeinde as a full-time rabbi, then the way that I would do with that is that community would have the standards of essentially the Orthodox teshuvot that would apply, which would be if that person was born a Jew, halakhically speaking, according to Orthodox tradition. So if they walked in and they have their mother's ketubah with them, essentially, then I recognize them as a Jew. I'm not going to call them up to Torah until I've spent a lot of time with them. And so what I would do is I wouldn't take them through a conversion process. I would take them through a personal process, welcoming them back for two reasons. Number one, I would want them to be able to have, and I would probably have them join the conversion class, but I don't call my conversion classes. I call them gateways into Judaism so that everyone can take part and come at it from different directions. But I would probably welcome them into a class like that, make sure they could speak enough Hebrew to do the bracha, make sure they understood they're happening. But what's really going on is I'd be making sure that they didn't believe that Jesus was God. Not because that isn't a path that is its own path, but part of my job when I go through conversion is to ask the question on, is someone a Christian? And this isn't a value judgment. This is qualitative, this is quantitative and not qualitative. And if the checkbox is, I believe that Jesus is God, then you're a Christian. Be a Christian. If you want to participate in some Jewish rituals, there are lots of places out there to do it. But what you don't do is say, no, you're wrong, and the authentic Judaism is the ones who follow Christ, or that sort of thing. Like, no, you don't get to do that. Jews have paid the price for being able to self-define. And that's my issue with Jews for Jesus, and that's also its own discussion for its own day. So if someone comes through and they were raised Presbyterian, and what happens, and I've seen similar sorts of things, is the way that it usually manifests, the much more realistic, is someone grows up secular. And in Germany, that's what happens all the time. And then they find out, because it was a secret, that their maternal grandmother was Jewish. I've had that happen multiple occasions. Well, halakhically speaking, folks, they're Jewish. In an American Reformed synagogue, they'd have to convert. In an Orthodox synagogue, a rabbi who's sensitive to that is going to take them through a process before they're called to Torah. And that's exactly it. What it boils down to is, are we practicing arbitrary halakha, or are we practicing thoughtful halakha? Halakha is a guideline and a path. Whenever it's arbitrary, then I think that we don't understand what halakha is, since halakha is constantly evolving and changing. And it's living and breathing. It's something we get to engage in dialogue with. So I guess that would be the longer answer for that one. I wouldn't treat a Sabbatian or someone who is Jewish but brought up Catholic any different than someone who was brought up secular. If they're halakhically a Jew, they're halakhically a Jew, but they don't get called up to Torah until I know that they're Jewish as well as a Jew, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
To be uncontroversial with my use of language whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit difficult. You know, you also have like this issue that you're not allowed to shame someone in public. So
yes.
You can't just refuse the person or whatnot, and it's always complicated.
I went to a conservative synagogue in Israel. I will not say which one, and I think the 10th person that was in there for Kabbalat Shabbat, and the rabbi, who is a rabbi I know and I respect, came up, did not know me at the time, and said, I need to ask the question. He was very polite. No one was within hearing. I need to ask a question. Are you a Jew? And I said, well, I'm a rabbinical student, so I'd better be. And he looked at me and he said, that actually doesn't answer the question.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was not done in hearing of anyone else. It was done respectful. It was still hard to deal with because that never happened to me before. But I was unknown in the community. And they wanted to make sure a minyan was there. And so I said, yes, I am a Jew by the laws of Moses. And so it turns out that I developed a lot of respect for this rabbi. But, it is something that happens. How we deal with halakha is, I think, as if not more important than our knowledge of halakha itself sometimes. Because halakha can be used as a stone to smash someone's head or something to chisel a beautiful statue.
Yeah. In the end of the day, I think it always takes people who I don't know how to say this, like who have who are sensitive enough, or is this correct? I don't know how to say this.
Fingerspitzengefühl,
yeah,
say in
exactly.
German. Someone who has a deft touch.
Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, I'm not claiming that I'm that person, because I've got my areas of specialties.
Right.
So I'll have deft touch in some things, and in other things I'll be smacked on the side of the head and say, I don't know what to do in this situation.
Yeah, right. But in the end of the day, it's also about, that you try to lift people up and not tear them down. And if you approach a person with respect, then even such a question can be perceived as something neutral rather than something to, question status or whatnot.
Well, so let me go ahead and give I don't usually, when I usually use myself as an example, I tend to try to use me as the way not to do it. But one thing that I'm pretty proud of, that's very controversial, and people who know that I'm relatively traditional, a lot of the way that I look at ritual might be surprised at this, but I'm one of the rabbis out there who will absolutely do ceremonial religious marriages for a Jew and a non-Jew. I'll actually do a chuppah. Now, I do that with a lot of caveats. I won't do a dual commitment ceremony, and I won't do it inside a church. So it'll be a Jewish ceremony with me in control of that. And if you have questions of why that would be, ask it, and we'll get non-controversial on that one as well. But there was actually someone who grew up New York, modern Orthodox, whose parents were rabbis, who was marrying a non-Jewish woman. I was asked to had a relationship with them. I was asked to do their wedding. And so a lot of their friends were yeshiva friends that showed up. And they wanted to meet the silly Reform rabbi who was going to, out of ignorance, do the ceremony. And I am friends with several of them. And if any of you are watching this, thank you for the wonderful feedback you gave. But after the ceremony, they came up to me. There was the ringleader of them, came up and said that was done sensitively, and that's something that I would stand up in an Orthodox synagogue and say was done right. Now, what was done right? Well, first of all, it was talking with the couple and what the symbols are, and then saying what I would not do. And what I would not do is a ketubah. So ketubah is a document between two Jews. All right? It's why? Because you have to, the ketubah is a legal document that you have to have the status of Jew in order to be able to sign. So I will not do a ketubah unless it's two Jews. And that's a very long conversation. It's not racist and it's not exclusive. It's actually a status issue. And this happens all the time. You can't rent a car unless you're 25. You have to have the status of being 25 to rent a car. Maybe it is discriminatory, but it's based on insurance premiums and whatnot. So this is part of the legal functioning system of a Jewish community that a ketubah exists. It doesn't mean that the state of marriage doesn't exist. It means that a ketubah can only exist between two Jews. So if I'm not marrying two Jews, I won't do ketubah. I'll do a zecher ketubah. I'll do a romantic document that says we love each other and we bind ourselves to each other and read that in the place of it. But I will, in the ceremony, make a point that this is not a ketubah, which is an Aramaic document that has a very specific formulation. So that's number one. Number two, I change some of the words. So in the beginning of the ceremony, in the Erosim, part of the text is, I bind myself to you according to the laws of Moses. And so, da'at Moshe. And I changed that to Kaminhag Moshe, according to the tradition of Moses, because Moshe Rabbeinu did not marry a Jewish woman, right? She married Zipporah, who was Midianite. So that is, you do those two things, and you are being conscious about halakha, you're not shaming someone, and you're doing the other thing, which is so powerful, and that is, if you close the door to a synagogue and lock someone out, they will never come back again, and a church will be very happy to open the door. And you know what? There's maybe a possibility that 5 years down the road, someone's going to convert to Judaism. Or maybe there's a part that non-Jewish partner will become the biggest supporter of the religious school, which I have seen over and over again. So why are we shutting the doors in people's face? At the same point, halakha means something, Jewish tradition means something. So let's do something consciously, traditionally, and at the same point, something that is going to help keep the doors open of people who want to have a relationship with Judaism. So that's controversial, everything that I just said there, but I'll absolutely stand behind it, and I'll stand behind it halakhically as well as personally.
Okay.
And by the way, that male has kept a very strong relationship with Judaism that entire time, and oftentimes both partners were seen in synagogues. So there it is.
Yeah. I think the right approach.
I hope so. And
prejudice.
But if you disagree, then, and if you want to respectfully engage in dialogue on that one, then please comment or send an email to BeitVirtuali@gmail.com, and we'll make it a part of a podcast or a video, because I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying that this is a path that I will stand behind.
Yeah. All right. So I have one last question.
Okay. We're not doing the last question without doing this again.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Oh, no. This last question is doozy. Okay. All right.
I'm just going to read the question.
Okay.
that also came from another Patreon that asked us last week, I think, about Toratah, which I don't know either. So I'm really curious
So I'll
about
talk
what it
about it, sure.
is. So maybe you can you explain to us, give a background, what is it, and then venture your opinion if you want.
Okay, so Toratah means her Torah, by the way, would be the translation of that, or the Torah of her.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's translations from Hebrew, or interpretations, not translations. And that's part of my answer. So I got this question and passed on to Katrin to bring up. First of all, one of my dearest friends asked the question, so thank you, dearest friend, for putting me on a tightrope. But I actually want to start off with the meta answer, and this is where it gets as serious as it gets, and this is where we're going to gain and we're going to lose people who want to be a part of BeitVirtuali, and it is what it is. And that is, so what Toratah is a complete rewriting of the entire Torah with every gender switched. So anything that's a who becomes a he, everything that's a he becomes a who. And anything, and then the entire noun structure. So anytime that God is there, it becomes a female form instead of male form. So essentially, if you translate it instead of God into goddess. So you've got every single gender switched, and so Moses becomes a different name, a female version of Moses. Miriam becomes a maleized version of that name. So every gender is switched in the entire Torah.
So the translation into English then
No,
is switched,
the
or the
Hebrew is switched. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
On the basis of what?
So we'll get there in a second. All right, so that's what Toratah is. If you want, I'll actually link to Beit Toratah in down below once we get this up on the internet after the live podcast, and go ahead and look at it. And actually, if you read through the interviews with the person who's responsible for Toratah, this experience of her doing this has been life-affirming and life-changing. And so that's all there. Now, here's the meta thing before we get into it. And the meta thing is what's difficult about talking about Toratah is, this is the zeitgeist of 2021, and that is many of you, especially those who know me pretty well, are going to listen to this thoughtfully. Some of you, because I'm a apparently male rabbi who is talking about an issue of feminism and a relatively radical feminist idea within Judaism, some of you are looking to not be happy, or some of you are probably thinking that I'm not going to have a right to talk about this because the nature of it, that this is an unfair use of my platform as a rabbi. And there are hopefully no one out there, but there might be people who will be listening to what I say solely to take something out of context to be able to use that as, this is a perfect platform for cancellation at this point. And this is where a male rabbi, well, I guess the assumption would be, says something negative about Toratah, and I would hope to think that my opinion is going to be much more nuanced than that. But I guess if you're in that last category, someone who is only going to listen to what I'm going to say at this point about Toratah for the sake of tearing it down, then this is, you have no desire for dialogue, and that's not what BeitVirtuali is about. Second of all, if we've come to a part of the zeitgeist where I have lost sleep over the last week on what kind of answer I'm going to give to this question, then we've entered a place where it's dangerous, because my qualification to be in dialogue with something is that I'm a human being. My qualification to be in dialogue with something as an expert is that I'm a rabbi. And my qualification to have a personal opinion on how it affects me specifically in the same way it affects the author, I don't have that because I'm not a woman. So what that means is I have, out of two, I get to be in dialogue because I'm a human. I get to give an expert opinion because I'm a rabbi. And I acknowledge where I then fail the experience to then go third dimension into it. So if someone's already upset at this one, this is a really good time to unfollow and unsubscribe and step away. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that those of you who now and in the future become a part of BeitVirtuali understand that dialogue is dialogue, and Judaism is predicated on us disagreeing with each other passionately. Read the first few pages of the Avote Rabbi Natan, and talking about the rabbis who screamed so much at each other in disagreement that people thought that they were worst enemies, and they were actually the most beloved of friends, and their passion came through passionate disagreement. We need to be respectful in disagreement, but if we create a situation where you can't disagree with me or you don't share my opinion, you're a bad person, we have lost sight of Judaism top to bottom. So that's the meta content about it, and I'm going to talk about it unapologetically after this. Whew. So I want to approach this from 3 different directions, and the first one is how do I feel generally about someone who is regendering within Judaism? And the answer is, I think it's brilliant midrash. I think that this is absolutely brilliant midrash. So what I mean by that is, when I think of brilliant midrash, I think one of the greatest midrashim ever written was Anita Diamant's The Red Tent. Okay, doesn't claim to be Torah. What it does is it takes a part of Torah and it helps us understand the life of women, Dinah specifically. It's told from the standpoint of Dinah, and using anthropology, archaeology, and the biblical text comes up with what I think is probably archaeologically and anthropologically the most accurate version of that time period in proto-Judaism that we possibly have. And if you haven't read The Red Tent, I'll also link that down below. I think it's I know a book that offends many people, and I kind of love it when that happens. It's a brilliant book. It's brilliant midrash. It also contains within it a great deal of truth. So it's brilliant midrash, and it falls very much, I think, into, and Toratah as well, into the ideas that people like Judith Plaskow brought in the early 70s and late 60s into Judaism. And if you haven't read Standing Again at Sinai, I think it should be required reading. She's a little bit difficult to read. It's not the easiest literary style in the world, but essentially the argument that Judith Plaskow makes is, and she brings the word patriarchy into Judaism, and that's worthy of its own debate, and not for this particular podcast, but she brings the term in and essentially saying that, listen, there have been stories of women in our tradition that have been edited out of the tradition, and part of what our obligation as Jews in this modern and postmodern or late modern times is to re-engage with the stories of the women in our tradition. And one of the ways to do that is through the midrashic process. Midrash in Judaism is considered an equal process of the outlining of Torah. And so we have the Torah story, and then to understand it better, we add stories to it. And the example that's always a great one to use is, many people think the story of Abraham destroying all the idols in his father's shop, Terah, who was an idol maker according to Midrash. People think that that's in Torah, and it's not. It's Midrash, but it's got so much resonance and so much truth to it that people project it into Torah. And a lot of people think that that's actually a story from the Torah. And it is an explanation that is, it helps us understand Torah more, because Torah is full of interpretive gaps, places where we can step in. You know, read the entire story from Moses' birth to the time that he finds Zipporah at the well. That's about a chapter and a half of the book of Exodus. 2 hours of a movie, and it takes place in 30 verses. Torah is absolutely compact, shorthand, and filled with places where we can write something into it. And so Midrash is meant to fill in those gaps, and Judith Plaskow says, let's fill in those gaps with the stories of the women of our tradition. Now, I'm going to be a little bit ranty for a second here, because I've served as a rabbi in 4 different countries, and I've asked this question every community I've ever been at. And these are communities that would absolutely say, we believe that filling in these traditions of female voices is important. And so the question I always ask is, so we have, first of all, how many prophetesses do we have in Judaism, and name them? And I have so right now, test yourself. You're watching this. Okay, don't go to Wikipedia. Don't go to Chabad.org, because they have a great article on it in there. Don't do it. Don't go to the Talmud to look it up, which is where the listing of 7 comes from. Can you right now name who the 7 prophetesses are? I'd better be able to make sure that I can do it right now. So the 7 prophetesses, according to the Talmud, are Sarah, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, Huldah, Abigail, and Esther. So if we can't do that, then why are we creating midrashim when we have not even gone through and learned what's there? I mean, how many people have studied the not many passages of Devorah? But again, I just said we've got 30 verses for the entire birth up through the well scene with Zipporah of Moshe Rabbeinu. We've got about the same many verses as Devorah, plus the song. And how many of us know that out of all the leaders in Judaism, the people who had a kingly, queenly, a monarch sort of status, she was a judge, which functioned essentially as a monarch in that time. She is the only person that there's no critique on her whatsoever. She did nothing in her reign other than being the wisest person at the time. So how many of us have studied the implications of that story in the time of the judges, that would be the case? How many of us know that there was in the Hasmonean Empire a queen, Shlamtzion? So, if we don't know the stories that are there, and we're saying that we need to fill in the gaps and make changes, then I think that we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and say what's actually about educating ourselves and finding those archetypes in our tradition, and what's about being arbitrary to tear down something. So that's number one, is let's learn what's there first, not taking away from Judith Plaskow and the other people who believe, as she does, which I am one of them, that it's our job to learn more. I mean, here I'm sitting next to one of the world experts in Bruria. I say the word Bruria. How many of you out there can identify her and why she's significant? And if you want Katrin to talk about it, you better ask the question to get her to talk about it in a podcast. So, we have these amazing figures in our tradition that we can learn so much about. And Katrin and I are working on some stuff regarding this in a book that we haven't announced yet. And that's our starting place. So that's number one. So this is brilliant Midrash. And going to the second point that I'd make is what's happening. The part of this that I disagree with profoundly is it's the way that I understand of what's happening is this is being written onto a Torah scroll by a scribe, and it's being read in communities, bimkoma Torah, so in place of the Torah. And I disagree with that profoundly. And there's 2 points I want to make on that one. Number one is, should the Toratah be read in the synagogue? And the answer is, should Midrash be read in synagogue? And the answer is, yes, of course. Is there a place for this kind of midrashic challenge to genders? Because right now that is part of the zeitgeist. Is there a place for that in synagogue? Absolutely. It creates dialogue. It forces us to absolutely relook at assumptions. 100%, completely. But should it be read in place of Torah? And the answer is no. Can it be read almost at that level? The answer is absolutely yes. And we have this pattern of going back to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which has a fair amount of historicity in it, that after 3 generations of being schlepped away to Babylon, we didn't speak Hebrew anymore. Our lingua franca was Aramaic. So in the book of Ezra, we have the priest Ezra reading Torah for the first time after the repopulation of Jerusalem. And what we find out is the Torah was read, and then it was read in Targum, the entire translation of it. And so what most likely happened was the Torah was read and then a complete Targum of it. And that's, by the way, exactly as it's done in the Yemenite community today. Torah is chanted, and immediately after the Targum, the Aramaic translation is chanted. So what I would suggest is my problems with Toratah, or my challenge or my critique of it, has nothing to do with our right to do it. It's a midrashic process. Time will tell whether there's resonance to this as beautiful midrash. But if you look at a Torah that has commentators on it, the Mikraot Gedolot, the great writers, then what you see is the Torah text, and then around it, you'll see the commentators. And usually right next to it, you have one of the Targumim. Same thing when we actually read the Talmud. You've got the closed Talmudic text surrounded by Rashi, the Tosafot, and then the other commentators that are in there. So is there a place for having a Torah out there that has Toratah in the place of a Targum? 100%. And how beautiful would that be to actually see what challenges we have to our ideas of gender when it's switched around? But if we're calling people up for an aliyah to read that in place of Torah, I think that it's dangerous. And we enter dangerous. Why? We enter into a philosophical concept called Chesterton's fence. And Chesterton's fence, it comes from a late 19th century, early 20th century theologian, amateur theologian, is philosopher, is a British literary figure. And G.K. Chesterton talked about 2 people are walking in a field and they see a fence. And the fence annoys the heck out of one of the persons and the other person not. So the person who the fence annoys says, let's tear this fence down. And the other person says, unless you can tell me the exact reason that this fence exists, don't tear it down. Now, this is, I would say, theologically would fall much more into Masorti Judaism than it would into Orthodoxy or Reform. But it's basically saying, unless someone can explain why Torah is closed exactly as it is, I think replacing it is at our own peril in this one. And what's my proof for this one? There are 7 billion-ish people on the face of this planet. There are 16 million Jews, 0.2% of the world population. We're a non-evangelical group. We don't pass on a religion by the sword. We haven't for 2,200 years. Yet somehow we exist, and the centrality of our existence is the fact of two things. Number one, that we have a core document that has an eternal flexibility that allows us to constantly reinterpret over time. And on the other hand, we have created a system that allows us this midrashic process. So we haven't locked our tradition in time because, as Mordecai Kaplan would say, paraphrasing him, the coin of our spirituality is the ability to reinterpret over the course of time. So if we, instead of saying the Toratah is a reinterpretation, if we say it is a replacement for the real thing, and I'm not even saying that the authors of Toratah are making that case, but if it's being read in the place of Torah, then that's the de facto reality of it. When that's happening, then we're tearing down the fence. And I have zero. If I went to a synagogue and I saw the Torah read and Toratah immediately chanted afterwards, I think that was bold midrash. Absolutely bold midrash. If I went into a synagogue, and I'm sorry, this is a very strong stance, and I saw Toratah being read instead and no Torah, I would walk out of that synagogue. And that is, there is a line of taking a document that has held up the test of time of being eternal and infinitely translatable to something that loses flexibility because it's already an interpretation that becomes locked. Which brings me to the final of a long series of points. And my main reason for having a critique of Toratah is because it becomes hyper-focused on gender. So the reason that the Torah is gendered is because the Hebrew language is a gendered language. They certainly didn't see gender in the same way that we're seeing it now in postmodern critique of gender. And so the first issue is we're backward projecting our current morality into the writing of it. And so that's why reinterpreting is a beautiful thing. But by rewriting the entire Torah, then by saying goddess instead of God, you can say the word God. One can say the word God and see that as gender neutral. You cannot see goddess as gender neutral. That then absolutely forces a gendering of the Torah in a different way. And the reason that's dangerous is because I'm very much a Maimonidean in Ani me'amin be'emo shlema. I believe with absolute complete conviction, so the second or the third of the 13 attributes of God, that God has no ein lo guf, God has no body, ein lo demuta guf, so there's nothing that can be compared to a body. And so as soon as we make gender the central focus of Torah, then what we've done is we've forced ourselves into seeing God more anthropomorphically. And so that goes back to our initial discussion, the video for this week. Why do I say de eviga, or the eternal? Because it is the least gendered of all the words that I can possibly think of. And I'm trying to constantly lead us out of that, because our problems with Judaism is we're constantly thinking of God as a dude. It doesn't help to think of God as a dudess. What we need to do is think of God as not a person or not anything with human attributes. So if you have something that is a contradiction of trying to remove ourselves from seeing God with human attributes, then I think that that takes us out of moving to a universal spirituality of radical interconnectivity and into something else. At the same point, as I read all the stories about Toratah, there are people who were re-engaged in their Judaism because of this activity. And I just went through this great screed when it came to marriages on keeping doors open instead of closed. And so I'll go back to the original point. I think that if we are conscious of what we're doing, if we become very aware of Chesterton's fence and why it's there, and we use something like Toratah as a very conscious part of the midrashic interpretive rolling out process of our tradition, what a beautiful, powerful conversational tool. You better know who the 7 prophetesses are first, though, just saying. But the second part is replacing Torah, a closed document at this point, when we have a system that allows for constant spiraling out of new interpretations, is basically saying that we're not allowed to interpret. It's saying that it has to be rewritten in order to be interpretable. And we already have thousands of years, including feminist thought, that interpret Torah. So I don't know if the tequila helped on that one. I think that's the end of the point to make on that. I'm fascinated by it, but it's not Torah, it's Midrash. And by saying Midrash, it's not denigrating it or tearing it down. It's saying that it is a part of an eternal aspect of what makes Judaism so powerful. It's a great Targum. It's a great Midrash. But Torah is still Torah.
Yeah, I still didn't really understand what's the what are the underpinnings. I think is it like bringing awareness, or is it like, do they want people to see Torah from a female perspective, or is it bringing awareness to
Mm.
that you can interpret it from a different way? Or this is like what I'm still not really sure about, to be honest.
Yeah, so it's I don't know how conscious a lot of what's being done in the Toratah process. I read a fair amount over the last week. I obviously in a week can't be an expert, and I'm certainly not going to speak for. And by the way, anyone who's part of Beit Toratah, if you get a hold of this podcast and you actually want to be on this podcast or whatnot,
Yeah.
I would love to have you on and to discuss this as, respectfully back and forth. Like I said, I'm fascinated. I think this is beautiful Judaism. I just don't think it's Torah. I think it's beautiful Midrash, and that should not be perceived as an insult. It falls into a line of applied postmodernism that was probably most typified by people like Judith Butler. Judith Butler is very hard to read. Her prose is very, very dense. But Judith Butler is kind of the beginning of queer theory. And queer theory deals with using queering as a verb instead of a noun. So to queer something is to so all of postmodernism and applied postmodernism is about taking something and then problematizing it. And you know that I do this all the time in how I teach Torah. I problematize it in its own way. So it's really not a whole lot different than what I do. It takes what I would interpret, and again, like I said, anyone who's involved in Beit Toratah, please correct me on this one. Be a part of this. I'll happily do a Zoom podcast. I'll happily be on your podcast. Let's make this a dialogue. But the concept of switching all the genders will make us hyper-focused on how male-gendered, generally speaking, the Torah is. Because every time that we see Elohim, it's going to be then dealt with in male compatible words that in Hebrew are going to be male, and anytime we see Adonai, then the compatible conjugations are going to be male singular conjugations and that sort of thing, which in a gendered language, just like in German, means that you pick the correct male thing. So if all of a sudden you turn all the genders around, you become hyper focused on just how much maleness there is in the Torah, which then makes one think of or ask the question on what unconscious things have come into us via this maleness. And that's a lot of what postmodernism, that's a lot of what the idea of patriarchy is what are the unconscious influences that we have because we've internalized patriarchy, that sort of thing. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with those ideas. I'm just trying to be technical on the use of them. So my guess is, whether deliberately or through the zeitgeist, that a lot of this falls into the continuum of Judith Butler and the idea of queering something. So to make something problematic, and because for so many years we, without thinking about it, have had no problem with the way that the Torah is gendered, even though, again, the language as it was written is different than how we look at gender today. But in order to call attention to that and the unconsciousness, you queerify it, or you queer it to queer something. And like I said, I think it's a fantastic pedagogical tool. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's just not Torah. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit.
If you go any more deeper questions into forcing me to talk about postmodernism, applied postmodernism, I'm going to need to do another tequila.
No, I think that we were very aware of patriarchy in the Torah for at least 50. What year do we have? 50 years. So sometimes it feels like, and I mean, it's like in every generation we kind of reinvent things that have been there sort of before, so but I feel, to say that we were not aware of how patriarchy was an issue in the Torah, I think is just not right, because this is what I studied.
Yeah.
We talk about it for at least 50 years, and there were controversies, and yes, there are also feminists that followed, opinions of at least misogynistic men, in my opinion. But we this was a fight that is going on at least since the late 60s, and to reinvent something and claim that now you've found the right solution, or now let's say the Holy Grail or whatnot, is problematic, I think. And also, as you already pointed out, like the basic of approaching, or the basic knowledge or the basic approach that you have on a text is always seeing a text in its time.
Right.
And if I just erase patriarchy from the Torah, then, to what extent do I whitewash history? Because if we make it disappear, then, let's say this becomes a mass movement, and then we only read Torata, and then we whitewash history, and then we don't acknowledge the suffering and the marginalization of women in the past. But also then the progress that we had throughout history. I mean, all the rules that we have on women in the Torah and in the Talmud, were at that time, 2,000 years ago,
right,
important rules that actually were progressive, if you want to put it like this.
For the time, sure, absolutely. Well, and I think that when we talk about taking an evolved morality of today, and I very deliberately choose the word morality instead of ethics in this point, because we need to differentiate between values, morality, and ethics. And that's probably another podcast, because I don't think educationally we do a very good job of understanding the difference between values, morals, and ethics anymore. But applied postmodernism into various critical theories and that sort of thing, we end up in a place where there is a morality that's evolving around that, and that's worthy of its own discussion on how that crosses Judaism, and how it crosses this sort of conversation and new media and all these sorts of things, and our lives in general, and things that have happened specifically. All that's really interesting, but it falls into any time that there is an evolved morality, evolving up, evolving down. It's just a different set of morality than looking back at the existential morality of the time of the writing and then the editing of the Torah, and then judging based on that one. And so the most common one that I get is, the Torah is fill in the blank for false or awful. And this is the Richard Dawkins levels of talking smack about religious traditions. See, I have tequila, and now it's the vocabulary is talking smack instead of other words that I could use. So thank you. Thank you. The idea that, well, obviously Judaism, or Judeo-Christianity, as you'd probably say, has no evolved morality, because if it was evolved morality, then it would just say slavery is forbidden, instead of having rules for how to deal with slavery and that sort of thing. And that's the height of arrogance, on believing that if I were in that place and time, that I would have a high enough evolved morality to be able to understand the difference. And you see the same sort of thing of people who are deeply embedded in Marxism, for example, saying that, well, you can't say that the fall of the Soviet Union is an example for why Marxism doesn't work, because if I would have been there, it would have functioned perfectly. And you, having grown up where you grew up, might have some critiques that are a little bit practical on that, as we're living right now in the deep heart of GDR. And one can still see a lot of the remnants of what that did. So, this idea that we can take what we've learned through a radically different upbringing and then go back to a place in the past and we would have acted radically different is pretty incredible. But Judaism allows for two things. And again, this is the midrashic process. It allows us to project ourselves into the past via interpretation. At the same time, it presents the stories as they were, so we can still see the universality of those sorts of things, which is why in the genders as they exist, the story of Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham saying to the Egyptians, Sarah's my sister and not my wife, which is horrible, absolutely horrible. Well, that's an unwhitewashed blemish on the morality of our paragons. Why? To teach us that we are all capable of betraying in the most horrible ways the people that we're close to. And if any of those stories get whitewashed, we lose the ability to see the darkness that's inside of us. And the most, if spirituality is a union process of individuation, of experiencing both anima, animus, and then the shadow, the Torah, unlike many religious texts, contains within it the shadow. It is unwhitewashed. Moses has anger management issues. He murders someone after he sees them murdering someone else. He goes to the well and he beats a whole bunch of people up right there. This stuff allows us to discuss. David HaMelech, first wife via an act of not only cheating, finding a married woman, but then also having her husband murdered. These are in there not so that we can say the Torah and the Tanakh are backward in their morality, so that we can see a reflection of when we do something that is at least metaphorically that bad, God forbid literally that bad, but metaphorically that bad, how many times do we betray our friends? How many times do we ask our partners to represent themselves in a different way to make us look better or feel more? This is the reality of humanity. And the reason Torah is eternal is because in the closed form that it came to around the 3rd century BCE, it became something that we've been able to look at for 2,300 years and constantly look in the mirror and say, all right, I need to evolve because I see myself reflected. And we change ourselves out of that, it's a risk. And if we try to create a new closed version because we want to only project our morality into the past, it gets really dangerous. Should we not challenge gender standards of the past? Of course we should. That's absolutely it. Should we not read people like Judith Butler? If you can get through it, it's actually some of those fascinating stuff that I've actually read in the last 2 years, and crosses over, finds parallel path with some of the Jungian archetypal stuff that I teach constantly in pastoral counseling. It's hard stuff. I disagree with a lot of it, but it doesn't mean that we can't learn something by it, and I believe Toratah is something we can learn from. But, oh my goodness, let's be careful before we call it the thing in and of itself. And I guess it goes back to the original point. All these things that we can do that are pushing the boundaries of Judaism, let's do it. But let's know why we do it. And let's make sure that we're thinking of the implications of what we're doing.
Yep.
Is there a place for radical, interesting, pushing the boundary ideas in Judaism? You better believe it. Otherwise, I don't have a job, because that's how I teach. But if we write it on a scroll, kosher scroll, have it read as part of standard Torah as the Bimkom, as the full replacement for Torah itself, then I'm going to say no. This is stepping away from Judaism, even at the far edges of the very gigantic playing field. Yeah, we'll see how this one goes as far as answers. I'm really glad that the question was asked, because it forced me to wrestle with a lot of different ideas, and it forces us as a growing community to wrestle with each other. And, if we just talk about safe things, I try to be generally non-political, not because I don't have political opinions, but because I don't want to force any of our videos to be stuck in a place and time. If I mention Trump or Biden in every single video, then all of a sudden I've placed us in a non-universal discussion, and Torah is universal, which is kind of the entire point. So I avoid politics mostly because we've got a very, very, very diverse audience, and the Torah is part of everyone in the audience, just not someone to the political left or political right. So, and I think that someone on the political right or the Jewish right can be profoundly affected by rethinking how we deal with the female archetypes in our tradition, the female characters in our tradition. And I'll go out there and say, once again, how's a good first step for learning a little bit about the 7 prophetesses and knowing their stories and telling them the implications and where they archetypally touch us in the world today. That's a brilliant place to start. And once we have exhausted that, then let's move on to the next level there and make sure that everyone, when we talk about heroes, why aren't people naming their daughters Bruria? It's a cool name. It's also someone to be honored, I think, pretty amazingly within Judaism. So why don't people even know who Bruria are? Well, part of the reason is because of patriarchy. She was actually torn down by Rashi in this case. And we should know those things. We should be aware of where patriarchy has actually come in, and it's worthy of the discussion. At the same time, Rashi is unpredictable when it comes to how he dealt with issues of women as well. So, yeah, we'll see what happens with this one. if the audio turns out on this one, this will go into Spotify as well. What's happening with BeitVirtuali? We have a class a week from today in the evening. Another podcast next week. We're doing the podcast every week now. So send in your questions or comments. If it's hate mail, I just ask for it to be constructive and assume that I have as much of a right to opinion as you do on that one. And with that, become a member of BeitVirtuali. Go to patreon.com/BeitVirtuali. It's how you access our adult education right now. I think we're going to have a nice, tight, small class for the first one. Still have room for a few more people if you want to become a member. And any final words?
Nope.
Okay.
Have a great Sunday.
Enjoy whatever day it is you're watching this, or if you've watched this live and you're on the West Coast, go to bed now. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you for being a part of BeitVirtuali, and we look forward to the next time we see you. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.